Oh, wow. My aunt whispered just loud enough for everyone at the dinner table to hear, her voice dripping with that fake, sugary sweetness she always used when she wanted to insult someone while pretending she wasn't. She brought the cheapest dish here. I guess some people just don't like giving back. I heard her words, of course. She wanted me to. But instead of reacting, I just set my homemade green bean casserole down on the buffet table next to the carved ham and the trays of buttery mashed potatoes, acting as if I hadn't noticed the way she leaned in close to my cousin Jenny as she spoke, her hand delicately covering her mouth like a bad actress in a soap opera. She was loud enough for the whole room to catch what she said, and that was exactly the way she wanted it. I should have been used to this by now. Aunt Linda had made a hobby out of humiliating me at family gatherings, always finding something about me to nitpick and tear apart, always making sure I was the butt of the joke. Last Thanksgiving, it was my single status. She had made a big show of saying how brave I was for coming alone when everyone else had a spouse or a partner to bring. The year before that, it had been my career. Oh, it's so cute that you still think you can make a living doing that. She hadn't even bothered to learn what I actually did for work, but that hadn't stopped her from dismissing it. This time, she had landed on my contribution to Christmas dinner as the latest thing to sneer at, and she was going to wring every last bit of mean-spirited amusement out of it. I took a deep breath, ignoring the heat that crept up my neck, and walked away from the buffet table without saying a word. I wasn't going to take the bait, not yet. Linda thrived on reactions. If I had snapped back at her, she would have played the victim, acting as if I had attacked her unprovoked, just like she always did. No, I was going to let her dig her own grave first. Dinner went about how I expected it to. My parents, sweet and exhausted from hosting another big holiday, did their best to keep things light. My brother, Mark, gave me a sympathetic glance every time Linda opened her mouth, but he had long since learned that arguing with her was pointless. Jenny, the cousin she had whispered to earlier, avoided eye contact with me completely, probably too uncomfortable to acknowledge what had happened. And Linda? She was thriving. All throughout dinner, she found little ways to bring up my so-called stinginess, always in that same innocent, who me? kind of way. It's just so funny how different people prioritize things, you know? She mused at one point, swirling her wine glass in her hand while casting a glance in my direction. Like, some people will drop hundreds on concert tickets, but don't want to spend a little extra on the holidays. Oh, Linda, my Uncle Greg chuckled, shaking his head at her. Let's not start anything tonight. Linda gasped, touching her chest as if she was shocked that anyone could possibly think she was being rude. I'm not starting anything, I swear. I'm just making an observation. Then, with a pointed smile at me, she added, "No offense, Rachel." I smiled back at her, slow and deliberate, my fingers curling around the stem of my own wine glass. None taken. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. But that didn't mean I was going to let it go. Because the thing was, Linda had no idea what she was talking about. She had no idea that the reason I had brought a simple green bean casserole to Christmas dinner this year wasn't because I was cheap or lazy. She had no idea that 2 weeks ago, my parents had pulled me aside, looking more exhausted than I had ever seen them, and confessed that money had been tighter than they had let on. My dad's medical bills had stacked up higher than expected, and my mom had been too proud to ask for help. They had planned to keep Christmas dinner small this year, just a ham, some potatoes, nothing too extravagant, because they simply couldn't afford to go all out like they usually did. And she definitely had no idea that, without hesitation, I had pulled out my credit card and told them, "Don't worry about it. Get everything you normally would, and I'll cover the whole thing." Linda had spent the entire evening making snide little comments about generosity, about people who pull their weight, but she had no clue that the only reason she was even sitting in front of that huge, expensive meal was because I had quietly paid for all of it. And I wasn't going to tell her. Not yet. She was so smug, so confident in her assumption that she knew who I was, that she knew my motivations, that she knew my financial situation. She thought she had me pinned down, and that was what made this so much better. So, instead of fighting back, I just sat there, drinking my wine, letting her embarrass herself over and over again, letting her talk and talk, running her mouth without realizing that every single word she said was going to taste so much worse when she found out the truth. And then, just as the plates were being cleared away, Linda clapped her hands together and said, "Next year, maybe we should have a real Christmas dinner where everyone pulls their weight." A few people at the table chuckled awkwardly, shifting in their seats, clearly uncomfortable. My parents' faces fell. My brother sighed heavily. Jenny looked like she wanted to crawl under the table. But me? I just smiled, swirling the last bit of wine in my glass, because I already knew exactly what I was going to say. Not now. Not yet. But soon. And when I did, the silence that followed was going to be the most delicious thing on the table. I sat back in my chair, my hands folded loosely in my lap, watching as the conversation at the dinner table ebbed and flowed around me, the same as it did every single year, with the same voices dominating, the same jokes being repeated, and the same tired family dynamics playing out like a well-worn script. Aunt Linda, as usual, was the loudest, the most eager to insert herself into every topic, and the first to act as if she was the most generous, the most thoughtful, the most important person in the room. She had always been this way, ever since I was a kid. Linda was the kind of person who would show up late to a potluck with a single bag of store-bought dinner rolls and then act as if the whole event would have fallen apart without her contribution. She loved being the center of attention, but more than that, she loved taking credit for anything remotely nice or successful, even if she had done absolutely nothing to earn it. And if someone else happened to get a little too much praise, if someone else was getting more recognition than she was, she would find a way to chip away at them, piece by piece, until she was standing taller by comparison. It wasn't just me who had been on the receiving end of her passive-aggressive cruelty over the years, but I had certainly been one of her favorite targets. Maybe it was because I was the quiet one, the one who didn't fight back, the one who let things slide more often than I should have. Or maybe it was because I was the only one who didn't seem to need her approval, who didn't try to win her over, who didn't fall for her manipulative games. Either way, she had made it her personal mission to put me in my place at every holiday gathering for as long as I could remember, and this Christmas was no exception. Linda leaned forward slightly, reaching for her wine glass, her voice dripping with artificial warmth as she said, "Jenny, sweetie, I have to say, your cranberry sauce is just like Grandma's. It's honestly incredible. I don't know how you do it." Jenny, who had been poking at the remains of her mashed potatoes, gave a weak smile and said, "Oh, thanks, Aunt Linda. It's really just the basic recipe." Linda gave an exaggerated gasp, placing a hand over her chest as if she had just heard the most shocking thing in the world. "Oh, don't be modest, sweetheart. Some people just have a natural talent for cooking, and clearly, you got that gene." Her eyes flicked toward me as she took a slow sip of wine, her meaning perfectly clear. I didn't take the bait. My brother, Mark, however, rolled his eyes and muttered, "For God's sake, Linda." Linda's head snapped toward him so fast that I was surprised she didn't give herself whiplash. "What?" she said, her voice high-pitched and innocent. "I'm just complimenting Jenny. Is that a crime now?" Mark sighed, shaking his head, but didn't say anything else. He had learned the same lesson I had over the years. Arguing with Linda was pointless, because no matter what, she would twist everything around to make herself the victim. The conversation moved on, but Linda wasn't done. She never was. A few minutes later, as plates were being cleared and desserts were being set out on the table, I heard it, the thing that made my hands tighten around my napkin, the thing that nearly made me break my silence right then and there. Linda, leaning toward her sister in the way she always did when she wanted to be heard without technically addressing the whole room, said in a voice just loud enough to carry, "Rachel has no clue how expensive these meals are. She just shows up and eats. Some of us actually contribute." The words sent a slow, simmering heat through my chest, a quiet, steady burn that only grew stronger with each second that passed. I could have said something right then. I could have turned to her, looked her straight in the eye, and let her know exactly how wrong she was. I could have told her the truth, that the only reason she was sitting in front of this expensive meal, drinking this expensive wine, eating these expensive desserts, was because I had paid for it. But I didn't. Not yet. I wanted to see just how deep she would dig herself into this hole before I buried her in it. I sat quietly at the dining table, the low hum of conversation flowing around me like white noise, watching as my Aunt Linda continued to bask in her own self-importance, completely unaware of the trap she had built for herself with every smug little comment and every passive-aggressive remark she had thrown my way throughout the evening. She was still laughing, still reveling in her usual performance, making sure her voice carried just enough to keep everyone within earshot, her glass of wine swinging lazily in her hand as if she were the queen of the entire damn evening. I wasn't even mad anymore. Not really. Not in the way that she probably wanted me to be. That initial heat, that moment of irritation I had felt when she loudly whispered about my so-called stinginess, had cooled into something far more satisfying, something almost amused. Because unlike her, I already knew how this night was going to end, and I had absolutely no intention of stopping her from making an absolute fool of herself before we got there. I let my fingers trace over the rim of my wine glass as my father reached for the serving platter in the center of the table, offering seconds to anyone who still had room on their plate, though at this point, most of us were already full. My mother, sitting beside him, had barely spoken all night, though every so often, she would glance in my direction with an expression that was hard to read, something soft and knowing, as if she was waiting for me to make my move. It didn't take much to realize that she and my father were being especially nice to me tonight, more so than usual, and I knew exactly why. They still felt guilty, even though they shouldn't have. 2 weeks ago, they had called me out of the blue, asking if I had a few minutes to talk, their voices quiet and hesitant in a way that immediately set me on edge. My father had never been the kind of man to ask for help, not even when he probably should have, and my mother had always been the type to try to handle things on her own before ever admitting she needed support. So when they finally admitted that Christmas dinner this year was going to be much smaller than usual, that they simply couldn't afford to do something as extravagant as they normally would, I didn't even let them finish before telling them not to worry about it. I didn't make a big deal out of it, didn't let them turn it into some long, emotional conversation. I simply took out my credit card, covered the entire cost of the meal, and told them I didn't want to hear another word about it. The only thing I had asked in return was that they keep it quiet, not because I needed to hide it, but because I didn't want it to turn into some grand gesture. I wasn't interested in praise, wasn't looking for recognition. I just wanted them to enjoy Christmas without stressing over money. And now, here we were, with Linda holding court at the table, sipping on a glass of wine that she had loudly declared was incredibly expensive, despite the fact that I had personally seen her buy it from the clearance rack at the grocery store. "Oh, you have got to try this," she said dramatically, swirling the liquid in her glass before taking a slow sip, sighing in exaggerated pleasure. "I mean, it's not cheap, but you can really taste the difference when you buy the good stuff." I almost laughed. Mark, sitting across from me, shot me a look that clearly said, "Are you seriously just going to let her keep going?" I gave him the smallest smile in return. Linda, still completely oblivious, leaned back in her chair with a self-satisfied smirk. "Honestly, I wish more people understood that you get what you pay for when it comes to food and drinks," she continued, her gaze flicking toward me once again. "You can really tell when someone decides to go the cheap route." I tilted my head, sipping my wine, letting the moment stretch out just long enough to make her believe I wasn't going to say anything at all. Then, just as the last of the plates were being cleared from the table and the desserts were being placed in the center for everyone to grab, Linda clapped her hands together, her voice bright and sharp. "All right. Time for dessert," she announced, reaching for one of the serving spoons. Then, with a perfectly practiced sigh, she added, "Hopefully, someone didn't go cheap on that too." I set my glass down carefully, the sound of it meeting the table just barely audible over the low chatter in the room. I took my time, letting my gaze sweep around the table, letting the moment sink in. Then, with the smallest smile, I said, "Oh, don't worry. Everything here tonight is definitely paid for." And just like that, the first crack in Linda's confidence appeared. The first few moments after I spoke felt like a vacuum had sucked all the sound out of the room, leaving behind nothing but the quiet clinking of silverware suddenly pausing mid-motion, the barely audible rustle of fabric as people shifted in their seats, and the stunned expressions that flickered across the faces of my relatives as the weight of my words settled in. For once in her life, Aunt Linda had nothing to say. I didn't even look in her direction. I didn't need to. I simply lifted my wine glass, took a slow, measured sip, and let the silence stretch longer, filling the room like the rich scent of cinnamon and sugar wafting from the desserts in front of us. I had waited for this moment all evening, sitting through every whispered insult, every passive-aggressive jab, every smug little smirk that had curled her lips whenever she thought she had landed some devastating blow against me. And now, all it had taken was one single sentence to turn the entire room against her. Linda's fork clattered against her plate as she stared at me, her mouth slightly open, as if her brain was still struggling to process what she had just heard. Her usual quick-witted cruelty had completely abandoned her, leaving nothing but stunned, stammering silence in its wake. The satisfaction was almost intoxicating. Wait, what? Linda's voice was weaker than I had ever heard it, the sharp confidence she had carried all night suddenly gone. Across the table, my cousin Jenny was frozen with a bite of pie halfway to her mouth, her eyes darting between me and Linda like she had just realized she was witnessing something far more entertaining than she had expected this evening to be. My brother Mark was hiding a smirk behind his napkin, and my parents sat still, watching with the same quiet knowledge they had carried all night. Someone finally broke the silence. It was my Uncle Greg, who leaned forward slightly, his expression shifting from curiosity to something that looked suspiciously like guilt. "Rachel, you paid for all of this?" His voice was careful, as if he was trying to make sure he had heard me correctly. I finally turned my gaze toward Linda, just in time to watch the exact moment she realized she was completely and utterly screwed. Her face twitched, her lips parting as if she was about to say something, but no words came out. I let the silence hang for just a little longer before I finally spoke again, my tone light and casual, as if I had just remembered something unimportant. "Oh, yeah," I said, setting my wine glass down with a small clink against the table. 2 weeks ago, Mom and Dad told me they were thinking about keeping things small this year because they didn't want to spend too much. So, I just told them to get whatever they wanted and I'd cover it. I lifted a shoulder in a small shrug, my gaze locked onto Linda's wide-eyed stare. "No big deal." Another pause. Another breath of silence. Then, finally, someone let out a low whistle. Mark, of course, who was now barely holding back his amusement, his shoulders shaking slightly as he reached for his drink. Linda's face was rapidly shifting between shades of red and pale white, her mouth opening and closing as she scrambled to say something, anything, that would save her from the situation she had walked straight into. She looked like a fish gasping for air, floundering in the wake of her own arrogance. "Well," she finally managed, her voice slightly higher than usual. "I thought about covering the cost myself, but I figured we'd all pitch in." It was such a pathetic attempt at regaining control of the conversation that I almost felt bad for her. Almost. Across the table, Jenny visibly cringed, while my Uncle Greg let out a small cough that sounded suspiciously like a suppressed laugh. My father, ever the quiet observer, simply leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable, while my mother lifted her napkin to her lips, her eyes twinkling with something that looked dangerously close to amusement. I didn't respond to Linda's weak excuse. I didn't need to. The damage was already done. She had spent the entire evening making little digs at me, crafting this whole story in her head about how I was too cheap, too selfish, too unwilling to contribute. And now, in front of the entire family, that story had just been shattered in the most spectacular way possible. Linda, still clearly desperate to claw her way out of the hole she had dug, let out a forced laugh, reaching for her wine glass with slightly unsteady fingers. "Well, isn't that nice?" she said, her voice too bright, too forced. "I mean, it's Christmas, after all, right? We all do what we can to make it special. Mark let out an exaggerated snort into his drink. I just smiled, tilting my head slightly as I picked up my fork and finally took a bite of my dessert. The silence that followed was the most delicious thing I had tasted all night. The silence stretched on longer than anyone seemed to know what to do with, thick and heavy, pressing down over the table like a weighted blanket that nobody had asked for. I didn't feel it. I didn't feel the need to. I just sat there, calm and unbothered, letting the tension coil tighter and tighter around Linda as she struggled to regain her footing, her expression flickering between embarrassment, irritation, and something dangerously close to panic. She had spent the entire evening feeling completely confident in her ability to control the narrative, fully convinced that she was the one setting the tone, that she was the one with the upper hand. That she was the one everyone else would quietly agree with as she took her usual jabs at me. And now, with a single sentence, I had turned the entire thing on its head, knocking her off the pedestal she had built for herself without so much as raising my voice. For a long, drawn-out moment, nobody spoke, as if they were all waiting to see what Linda would do next, waiting to see if she would attempt to double down or if she would finally admit defeat. I could see it in her face, the war between her pride and her survival instincts, the desperate scramble in her brain as she tried to find an escape route from the mess she had created for herself. Then, just as the silence began to stretch past the point of bearable, Linda forced out a laugh, too high-pitched, too bright, too obviously fake to be anything other than an attempt at damage control. She reached for her wine glass, her fingers gripping the stem a little too tightly, as if she was hoping the alcohol would somehow help her find a way out of this disaster. "Well," she said, her voice just a little too loud, a little too forced, "that's certainly generous of you, Rachel. I mean, it's Christmas, after all, right? We all do what we can to make things special." Across the table, Mark let out an exaggerated snort, quickly disguising it as a cough when Linda shot him a sharp look, her mask of fake cheer slipping just slightly at the edges. Jenny, who had been uncharacteristically silent throughout this entire exchange, was staring down at her plate, her shoulders tense, her expression carefully neutral, though the corners of her mouth twitched like she was barely holding back a smile. I didn't respond right away. I just lifted my wine glass, took another slow sip, and let the moment drag out just long enough to watch Linda's discomfort deepen. Then, setting the glass back down with a quiet clink, I tilted my head slightly and gave her the kind of polite, mildly amused smile that I knew would drive her absolutely insane. "Oh," I said, my voice light, almost conversational, "but you were going to pay for the wine, right? That's what you said earlier." Linda froze for half a second, and I could see the exact moment she realized that she had, in fact, walked herself into another trap. "Well, she started, but I didn't give her the chance to finish. "You mean the $10 bottle I saw you grab at the discount store last week?" I continued, my tone still perfectly even, perfectly calm, perfectly pleasant. "That was really thoughtful of you, Linda." Mark made a choking sound that he barely managed to cover up by taking a sudden, very large sip of water. Jenny made a small, strangled noise that might have been a suppressed laugh. My mother, still holding her napkin delicately between her fingers, finally let out a quiet sigh, shaking her head as if she had been expecting this outcome all along. Linda's entire body went stiff, her knuckles turning white as she gripped her glass, her lips parting as if she wanted to argue, but she seemed to know that anything she said at this point would only make things worse. For once in her life, she was completely out of options, completely out of excuses, completely out of ways to twist the story back in her favor. The final humiliation came when she suddenly pushed her chair back with just a little too much force, the legs scraping loudly against the hardwood floor as she abruptly stood, smoothing her hands down the front of her blouse as if she had just remembered some urgent, pressing matter that absolutely had to be dealt with at that exact moment. "Well," she said, her voice still overly bright, still overly forced, "I should go check on, something in the kitchen." Nobody believed her. Nobody stopped her. She turned sharply on her heel and practically fled into the other room, her steps just a little too quick, just a little too uneven, her movements betraying the fact that she was running. That she couldn't stand to sit at this table for another second now that the air had shifted and she was no longer in control. And then, just as the last sounds of her retreating footsteps disappeared down the hallway, it happened. First, it was Mark, letting out a sudden, sharp bark of laughter, shaking his head as if he couldn't believe what had just happened. Then Jenny, finally allowing herself to smile, her shoulders shaking slightly as she reached for her drink. Then my Uncle Greg, chuckling under his breath, his amusement barely contained. And then, slowly but surely, the rest of the table followed suit, the tension dissolving into quiet, knowing laughter, the kind that wasn't loud, wasn't exaggerated, wasn't forced, but the kind that carried the unmistakable weight of relief. They all knew. They had all known, for years, exactly what kind of person Linda was. They had all sat through her little performances, her endless attempts to make herself look superior at someone else's expense. And now, for the first time in a long time, she had finally been caught with nothing to hide behind, no way to spin the story, no way to escape the truth of what she had done. I didn't laugh with them. I didn't need to. I just took another slow bite of my dessert, savoring the moment, savoring the absolute and total silence that Linda had left in her wake, the kind of silence that tasted sweeter than anything on the table. Because, really, that was the funniest part of all, wasn't it? The people who shouted the loudest about generosity were usually the ones who gave the least. And when it really came down to it, I wasn't the stingy one here. Linda was. She always had been.